Welcome to Status Check with Spivey, where we talk about life, law school admissions, leadership, a little bit of everything. Very much in the leadership category today. I am with one of the most accomplished humans on the planet, General David H. Petraeus, a four-star general, former director of the CIA, who was unanimously confirmed by the Senate 94-0. We will not see something like that for a long, long time. General Petraeus graduated from West Point. He spent a good portion of his career in the military. I should note that while in the military, and we talk about this in the podcast, he got his Ph.D. from Princeton while serving in the military. Almost couldn't be done. He did a lot of research on it, even if he could do it, and we talk about it. While in the military, he was also shot in the chest and rushed to Vanderbilt Medical Center. I was a Vanderbilt student when General Petraeus was in Vanderbilt Med Center, and they let him leave early because he was able to do 50 push-ups after being shot in the chest. Our paths didn't cross then, they crossed now. General Petraeus is a Kissinger Senior Fellow at Yale University at the Jackson School of Global Affairs. And this was like sitting in a lecture on a master class of leadership. We talk a great deal about leadership. I learned a tremendous amount from the leadership construct that David Petraeus put forth, some of which I'm really honored to say and proud to say that we use at our firm, particularly about being open-minded and not wanting to surround yourself with sycophants, but people who will disagree with you to learn from. We even talk a little bit about, are there aliens in Roswell? Without further delay, this was a great honor, one of the greatest of my lifetime. This is me with General David H. Petraeus. General Petraeus, it's great to have you. We know how demanding and busy your schedule is, so thank you so much for making an hour out of your time.
Good to be with you.
I'd love to start with current events. I know you've been talking a lot about current events. This one's a bit of an outlier. About 3 months ago, Dr. Eric Davis testified to Congress that there are 4 kinds of aliens: Greys, Nordics, insectoids, and reptilian. That's ridiculous, General Petraeus. Everyone knows there's only 3 kinds of aliens. Which are your favorite, and are they in Roswell?
Well, they're definitely out there in Roswell. I mean, again, I used to visit them in area, whatever it is, when I was a CI director, ensure that we were providing good care and feeding for them and helping to contribute to the ecosystem around them. As you know, there is actually an entire tourist ecosystem around the location out there. And again, they're the heart of it. So again, it was very important to me to ensure that they were being taken care of very well.
Thank you for taking good care of the insectoids. I would love to turn to leadership. Most of our audience are 18 to 26-year-old, and many of them are going to go on to be great leaders. You developed, when you were a 3-star general, and you were about to go in theater to command in Iraq, a construct for strategic leadership, if you want to explain to our audience what that was.
Sure. So again, we didn't just do the counterinsurgency field manual, which we desperately needed several years into counterinsurgency operations. We still did not actually have that doctrinal manual. We made numerous changes to the road to war for our battalions, brigades, divisions, and so forth. Overhauled the mission rehearsal exercise. But then personally, I sat down and developed an intellectual construct for the exercise of strategic leadership, because this is going to be the first time that I am the overall commander in a theater of war. I've been there as a 2-star, as a 3-star. It had a lot of latitude, but when you're at the very top, it is obviously very different. And there are 4 tasks, I believe, in this construct that a strategic leader has to perform and has to perform right. The first is to get the big ideas right, to craft the right strategy. In war, it means to understand the enemy, understand the nature of the conflict in which you're engaged, understand the geographic terrain, the human terrain, the neighborhood, how the country's supposed to work, how it really works, the ethnic, sectarian, tribal, political, and other elements that are there and so forth. And again, craft the right strategy, get the big ideas right. You then have to communicate the big ideas throughout the breadth and depth of the organization so that everyone, all the way down to the level of what we used to call the strategic sergeant and corporals, when they go outside the wire, they're turning big ideas at my level into concrete reality and real actions at their level, doing what only they can do, by the way, under body armor, Kevlar with weapon, and that is to engage the enemy, and also in the kind of war we are in, counterinsurgency, to engage the people as well. You also have to communicate to America's mothers and fathers. They have a right to understand what it was that I was trying to do with their sons and daughters and how we were coming along. Obviously, the White House, number 10 Downing Street, the Iraqi White House, again, and it's to all of our coalition forces, all of which were under command, but then to our Iraqi counterparts. to the Iraqi people. So it's a huge task, and you have to employ every single means and mechanism available to you to do that, including I actually developed my own counterinsurgency guidance at my level, a series of admonitions: secure and serve the people. We can only do that by living with them or going back downtown, gated communities, biometric ID cards. Promote reconciliation. We're actually going to try to strip away as many of the rank and file of the bad guys as we can. We're going to reconcile with them, something we should have been doing from a much earlier time. Pursue the irreconcilables even more relentlessly than we were. Promote more civil-military interaction and activity, and all the way down to one that I particularly liked, which was promote initiative. In the absence of orders, figure out what they should have been and execute aggressively. But a whole several pages of this, and I'd refine it, was always open as a document on my laptop, which I had wherever I was. There's always a communicator with me that would be giving me the secure and then the non-secure laptops to work on. The third task is to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. This is what we normally think of as leadership. This is the energy the leader provides, the example, the incentivization. It's hiring the best and brightest and hanging on to them as long as you can. It's allowing those not measuring up to move on to something else. It's the organizational architecture that you design for your undertaking. It's how you spend your time. Your battle rhythm is a crucial component of strategic leadership. And we spent a lot of time determining how I could spend my time as efficiently, effectively, and productively as was possible.
I think you and I may have the same sleep routine. They studied what your minimal optimal amount of sleep was, and it's 6 hours, right?
Well, 6 hours was absolutely the minimum. Keep in mind that you're doing this 7 days a week. So you're not sleeping in on Saturdays or Sundays. You can't sort of run yourself ragged and then recover on the weekend. So you're at your physical limit. And for me, it was roughly 6 hours is the minimum. Ideally, a bit more than that. If I'd get interrupted in the night, which was fairly rare, I wasn't getting called at all hours of the night. You basically made the big decisions. People below you are actually executing them. But every now and then, something would not go well during one of our targeted operations, or occasionally somebody from Washington would have something that was absolutely crucial, and the phone would start ringing, and you could actually see on these phones, point to point, who it was actually calling if it was from Washington. But generally, they were quite conscious of the fact that, we're right at the edge of our physical existence and we need that amount of sleep. And by the way, we had on my battle rhythm was physical fitness. Every morning I had an hour right when I got get up. 5:30 in the morning was a cup of coffee would come in the door. 5:45, I'd be on a stationary bike with an intel book from the night before. 5:30 to 5:45 was a quick review of secure internet. Get in a workout of various types, aerobic and some weights, body weight and stretching. Quick shower, very quick breakfast, and you're actually in the headquarters at 7:30 for the battlefield update and analysis that starts every day of the week at 7:30 and runs an hour. And there's schedule for what is covered during that, some that's every day, some that's a few times a week, once a week, every other week, et cetera. So all of this is very, very refined. And then you also have the metrics, and you've got to get those metrics right. You have to actually understand what the definition of a security incident is, for example. Where do you get the information? How do you deconflict it? So we brought a Rhodes Scholar Ph.D. out from the Air Force Academy to just ratchet these down, absolutely nail the definition, ensure everybody understands that. And then the Chief Warrant 5 intelligence officer would have to stand in front of me and tell me how he actually put together, because they owned these metrics. How do you gather the information that is being presented to me on a daily basis? And by the way, I'm going to use this in Congress 6 months from now, and we've got to have absolute confidence in it. Do we get information just from our forces? Is it from the Iraqi press? Is it from Iraqi counterparts? Is it from diplomats? How do you then, again, deconflict and ensure that this is the best possible information? Because we're going to stand on this. We're actually going to live or die on this, basically, because I'm going to lay it out to Congress, which is going to start at the 6-month mark, and we've got to have results by that point in time. So this battle rhythm is very, very important. There are actually events that enable you and in some cases force you to perform the fourth task of a strategic leader, which is to determine how you need to refine the big ideas, how you need to change the strategy, your approach, new big ideas, jettison old ones, refine others, tweak them as the situation evolves, as you achieve progress, success, experience setbacks, so that you can repeat the process again and again and again. It's a really good intellectual construct, I believe, There is a website. You might actually share it with those who are going to watch this. At Harvard's Belfer Center, where I was a fellow for 6 years, there was a team there of graduate students who had worked for me in the war zones that helped to distill all this into a series of interviews that lay out these 4 tasks and also lay out a variety of leadership tactics, techniques, and procedures, if you will, as well.
We'll link it on our blog with the podcast. We'll link not only that link of your construct, but also with the YouTube video. On number 4, this is the one that's so interesting to me, the pivoting and refining. And there's 2 elements to it. There's the internal element. Okay, what are we doing wrong? And then there's the external element. The enemy gets the vote. And I recently read a book. You're going to be so familiar with this incident. The book was called The Siege by an author named Ben McIntyre. There was a group of ethnic minorities in Iran who were essentially being exterminated by the new Iranian regime. And they took over, you'll remember, the London embassy for 6 days. And during the book, the part that stood out to me was Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher went to the SAS commander because negotiations weren't going anywhere. And 2 people had died, I believe. And Prime Minister Thatcher said to the SAS commander, "Are you confident in your plan?" And he responded, "We have a great plan, Prime Minister Thatcher, but we don't know the enemy's plan."
Well, the enemy does get a vote. And again, that's what you're dealing with. And you have to understand what the enemy's done. Did they succeed or fail? Why? If so, why? And how does that result in you needing to change the big ideas? And by the way, the other really big ideas, again, we're going to clear, hold, build. We're not going to clear and leave, which is what we were doing prior to the surge, which was not succeeding. Violence was escalating at a terrifying level, full-blown Sunni Shia civil war in Baghdad itself. So again, you have to sort out what is it that we need to do to react, as you started to see suicide vest bombers, car bombers, others. You're constantly tweaking these. And again, you have the really big ideas, but there's lots of other ideas that are part of this as well. And that's the leader's job. But the most important task is to get the absolute big ideas right. Because if you don't, it doesn't matter how great your communication skills are, what kind of inspiration or speaker you are, 6'2" with a great jutting jaw, none of that actually matters. The irony is we had some people that seemed to be exceptional commanding in Vietnam, but we failed to get the big ideas right for 13 years, from the mid-1950s until late 1968, when we finally realized we could not win a war of attrition with North Vietnam. The big unit war, we'd kill 10 of them for every one of us, or at least that's what the body count said, although that was called into question over time. But we should have been focusing from the very beginning on security of the people in the hamlets, villages, districts, and in the provinces, rather than chasing all over in the jungle and highlands and everything else. That doesn't mean you don't have components of that, but that should have been the focus. We didn't get that right until late 1968. And by that time, the Tet Offensive had already discredited the strategy. The light at the end of the tunnel did not appear to be there anymore, et cetera, et cetera. It took us, I'd argue, 7 years to get the big ideas right in Afghanistan. It wasn't until General McChrystal took over that we actually had the kind of approach that was necessary in a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign. And then it took another year to get the inputs right, to actually enable us to carry it out. And then unfortunately, we began drawing down from that within 6 months of actually finally getting the inputs right. By then, I was the commander on the ground. And then over time, unfortunately, what determined the pace of the drawdown ended up being much more conditions in Washington than conditions on the ground in Afghanistan, which is what it should have been. So anyway, getting the big ideas right is absolutely the be-all and end-all. And then keeping them right. Remember Kodak, which had phenomenal big ideas on film, photography, and services, was the king of all of that, had 2,000 patents on digital photography, and failed to make that the new big idea fast enough. Others got there. They've never, ever returned to the kind of prominence that they had back in film photography days. Or you look at Netflix unerring Reed Hastings, and big idea after big idea. First big idea, put movies in the hands of customers without brick and mortar, undercut Blockbuster, they go out of business. Now we note change. Broadband speeds are much faster. Situation has changed, so we need to change the big ideas. People can download movies. Now we're going to make our own content, $100 million on House of Cards and all of these other iconic series. And then we're going to make major motion pictures. And we buy 2 movie studios, not one, and earn more Academy Award nominations 4 years ago than any other major movie studio.
Two follow-up questions that come to mind.
Sure.
Number one will be a lot quicker and a lot more lighthearted. Do you have a favorite military or CIA movie that's realistic?
I have novels that are realistic, but certainly what Tom Cruise does in the movies bears sort of no resemblance.
Right.
The communications always work. He's central to every single thing that's going on. The director is watching intently the whole time, telling him to go left, go right. Again, this is completely nonsensical.
100% get that. What about Zero Dark 30? Any realism in the movies?
There was realism there, although the female lead was a composite of several women, not just one. But again, I know that was well grounded in reality. But I'd look at the novels of, say, David Ignatius. Also, there's a great one about the situation in Syria, Damascus Station, which I think is the best novel of all time and written by someone who worked for me back when I was the director. In fact, was involved with Task Force Syria.
We'll put a link on our blog.
Yeah.
The more serious question would be these brilliant people, they get the big idea wrong. It's always intrigued me. And I've studied it too. I recently read Donald Rumsfeld's biography. I'd read a number of books on Waco and Vietnam. And I'm not implying anyone I've just named got a big idea wrong. But were you able to crystallize and refine what was it that obfuscated their global view so that they were going in the wrong direction for 13 years in Vietnam?
Well, there's a number of factors typically. One can be that you have lessons of the past that you learned yourself, if you will. So for years, the lessons of Vietnam haunted those who were the junior officers of that war as they became the senior leaders. And I sometimes felt overly much. There's a whole body of literature on decision-making during crisis. And one of the elements that emerges in that is that experiences you personally had that were very visceral and powerful tend to influence you arguably too much, especially when you're doing crisis decision-making, which is, again, you have to make rapid decisions. You have imperfect information. People are calling on you. We got to make a call. And there's a tendency to fall back on what it is that you experienced, what you learned from that, whether it was the right lesson or not. In fact, my Ph.D. dissertation at Princeton was the American military and the lessons of Vietnam. And I chose that specifically. I chose that subject because I wanted to understand our experience in Vietnam, what seemed to be the lessons, at least the lessons that people had taken. Were they the right lessons? And so, I mean, one of the lessons was we don't ever want to, again, be engaged in counterinsurgency operations. So let's not study it. Let's not configure our forces for it. But, you don't get to pick the wars that you fight. The president does that. And we ended up engaged in two major counterinsurgency operations. And as I mentioned earlier, we didn't even have a doctrinal field manual, much less any discussion of this subject of a serious nature in our staff college, war college, the basic and advanced courses for our commissioned, non-commissioned warrant officer leaders. I think one of the books that captures this particularly effectively, The Best and the Brightest by David Halberstam, is about this extraordinary group of people that came into office with President Kennedy, all brilliant. The Brahmins, they're Harvard, they're Yale, they're all the Ivy League schools. And again, some of them just complete outliers in terms of their academic achievements. And yet, that was the group that got us into Vietnam, allowed the wrong strategy to be pursued by those in the field who claimed that they were well aware of counterinsurgency. And then there were, to be fair, certain initiatives like the Strategic Hamlet Initiative and others that were pursued at various times, but they were never the main effort. The main effort became the big war, and that's where the promotions were to be had. That's where the medals were, all of this. And that means big units, 1st Cavalry Division, 101st Airborne Division, 25th, all these units that were in there conducting search and destroy operations and so forth, which again were not correct. We could not win that war. And it wasn't until late 1968 that you had General Abrams come in, who didn't look the part necessarily. He was sort of rumpled, had a cigar in his mouth. He's an old tanker, not an airborne infantryman and all the rest of that. And he actually recognizes that we need to pull it all together. We need to focus on security of the people where they actually live. And we need to work together with the elements of AID and the CIA and all these others, everybody together. But by then it was too late. The Tet Offensive had happened. It had discredited the entire apparatus running the war from the White House all the way to the leadership in Saigon. And you could not sustain that effort at that point in time.
As a side note, from Abrams, we get the Abrams tank name, correct? From General Abrams?
We do. Of course, he was a heroic tank battalion commander in World War II. In fact, he was the unit that spearheaded Patton's turn on a dime to get to Bastogne and rescue the embattled 101st Airborne Division. The battling bastards of Bastogne, as then called themselves, who were encircled by the Germans, who had just conducted what turned out to be their last real significant offensive. And this was the Battle of the Bulge.
And then, so shifting from people like you later in your career, or General Abrams late in his career, to early in your career, leadership styles, there's this notion that people aren't born leaders. And I can't stand that. And I'm curious your thought. And I'll give you an example. I'm shy by nature. I was a very shy child. When I was in junior high, a group of my classmates were walking towards me and I would have to say hi to them. So rather than saying hi, I jumped into a bush and hid. But I looked at people out in the world and I set these goals. And then I became a 3-sport captain in high school and higher education, legal education leader. Then I became a leader in the business world. So I don't think I was born a leader. I think I watched the world and saw leaders like you and others and let them feed me and become a leader. So one, is that the case in how to do so? And two, more importantly, because you've talked about this, and I think of my football coaches, sometimes there's different leadership styles. Sometimes you need to be focused on negative reinforcement or positive reinforcement. So how does one become a leader? How does one develop different leadership styles?
Well, first of all, just to start with styles, my view is that leaders should not have just one hard and fast style. People would ask me, as you get more and more successful, everyone wants to ask you, so General, how would you describe your leadership style? And I think, they think I'm going to say firm but fair, or I don't know, I'm a micromanager, or I'm a hands-off, or whatever it may be. Actually, the style that you employ should be what will bring out the best in each of your direct reports, and they're all different. Some of them need a pat on the back once a year and they're good to go. Some need a pat on the back once an hour. Some need you looking right over their shoulder, but it depends. And then for the elements of your organization, first of all, collectively, the entire organization, but then there are different elements within you look at the CIA, for example, the analysts are very different, very cerebral, very academic, have great academic credentials, expertise, et cetera. Then say the operators, if you will, the human intelligence collection officers, the spies, really, the clandestine service officers and so forth. Again, they're all incredible. It's the most extraordinary workforce in the world, but they're different. And one is a bit more action-oriented, the other is a bit more cerebral. So how do you bring out the best in each of these? Well, I put my professor hat on talking to the analysts. On the operators, I put on my hat as a battlefield commander, having served with a number of the station chiefs in places like Baghdad and then throughout the U.S. Central Command area and all the rest of that, starting in Bosnia, actually, when we were all chasing war criminals and then terrorists together after 9/11. So first and foremost, the only way you can answer what is your leadership style is to ask what will be required in a leadership style to bring out the best in him, her, the organization overall, the elements of the organization, et cetera. And that's what you should try to provide as a style. Obviously, the style that brings out the best in a rompin' stompin' airborne infantry platoon, which I was privileged to lead as a young second lieutenant, it's a very different style from leading a multinational coalition. And it actually changes as you go up. You have to understand what makes them tick and provide that style of leadership. When it comes to the development of leaders, I think there are characteristics, qualities, attributes, et cetera, that we are given in our DNA. And the question is, how do you make the most of what it is that you have been given? You always run into limits. In athletics, look, I realized when I went from high school soccer, we won the championship my senior year and I was an all-star. All of a sudden in college, I realized I can't go around the corner with the ball on these backs, these fullbacks and so forth, that they are so fast in college that they're actually keeping up with me. That's a limiting factor. You have to recognize, again, you have so much God-given speed. That doesn't mean you can't make the most of what it is you're given, but there are some limits. I think it's probably the same case with leadership, except that I think you can do much, much more to develop yourself, and you develop yourself physically, mentally, intellectually, experiences that you seek. I always sought out of my intellectual comfort zone experiences from the very beginning. If all the infantry officers are going to the infantry advanced course, I want to go to the armor officer advanced course. And I did the infantry one by correspondence, so they couldn't send me to it. I wanted a different experience. I went to Princeton for graduate school. I was told I was committing professional suicide instead of going to the Ranger Regiment, which is where I'd intended to go. I went because my boss at the time, General Jack Galvin, who was a 2-star, then he was later Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and I worked for him 2 more times, including when he was the SACEUR. He said, have you ever considered raising your intellectual sights higher than the maximum effective range of an M60 machine gun? That's the maximum range organic system in an infantry company at that time, unless you count the mortars. Why do I care about anything beyond that? That's the artillery's job or the Air Force or the, you name it. But I got the point he was making. And that was a real out of my intellectual comfort zone experience. I found out there's people in the world that don't see it remotely through the same prism that I do and have serious differences based on all the way back to the basic assumptions of what's called the state of nature. In the absence of the Leviathan, the overarching power, would the state of nature be everyone hugging each other, or would it be everyone fighting each other, in which life would be nasty, brutish, and short, to quote from Leviathan? So this is really pretty important. I sought experiences, opportunities, assignments that would also provide vantage points. So I was the aide to the Chief of Staff of the Army and also his assistant executive officer. I was the one who traveled with him everywhere he went, not the XO. During the Panama invasion, the response to the San Francisco earthquake, which was led by the Army of all things in those days, and then the Gulf operations, Shield and Desert Storm. Years later, I was the exec to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for 2 years, our senior military advisor to the President and the Secretary of Defense and the senior military overall. I was the speechwriter for the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. These are incredible experiences because you're at the right hand of very, very senior individuals who are exercising strategic leadership, performing those 4 tasks I discussed earlier. And to see that, to be with them, to be behind them, look over their shoulder, what have you, while they're testifying or meeting or whatever, this is really, really very helpful. And you develop big ideas about certain aspects of your profession. Again, why did I do a Ph.D. dissertation on the American military and the lessons of Vietnam? I wanted to understand what was the character of military advice prior to Vietnam, what was it during Vietnam, what was that experience for those who experienced it, and then went on to senior leadership positions. How did it shape their advice? And I actually developed an idea that, if I'm ever in a senior position where I'm being asked for military advice, say on a drawdown, which is the toughest of all, I told 2 presidents this. I said, Mr. President, the only answer to the question you've just asked is yes, I will be honored to be nominated for that position. But I want you to understand who you're getting here. And among the issues that I would raise would be that when it comes to the drawdown, the advice I provide will be based on the missions you've given us and all the tasks and purposes involved in that, the facts on the ground, our forces, enemy forces, et cetera, and the situations there. Can we draw down without jeopardizing the ability to continue to perform the mission successfully, informed by an awareness that you have a lot of other issues that actually could lead you to disregard my advice or not heed all of it, not approve all of it. Look, you have to get reelected. You have congressional politics. You have budget deficits. You have strain on the force. You have an opportunity cost. If you keep forces in Afghanistan, you can't send them to the Indo-Pacific. On and on, all of these different elements that are factors in his decision-making that I understand, but my advice is driven by facts on the ground. And that was particularly powerful in the final case of this when I was advising the Obama administration on the drawdown in Afghanistan at the end of my year in command of the forces there. And I did not change my advice from the first meeting to the third meeting, even though it was clear that the president was not going to take it in full. And then I explained to the Senate the next day in my confirmation for the CIA director, because the very first question from the Republicans trying to make points against the president was that he had not approved my recommendation. I said that his decision was a more aggressive drawdown than I recommended, but he's the commander-in-chief. We'll follow that order, obviously. We'll do the very best we can with the resources that we're given. But again, yes, it's a more aggressive formulation of the drawdown than what I recommended. And then, okay, that's it. He listened, he went through it, and I had my say, and he made the decision. And, if they wanted, I could get into why it is that he might actually not agree or not approve what it is that I recommended. Unfortunately, then over time, again, as I mentioned, the drawdown over time became based more or less on conditions on the ground in Afghanistan and more, unfortunately, on conditions in Washington. And that's not the way it actually should be. But you get the idea here that I tried to have experiences, assignments, education, and then actually doing it myself and constantly trying to learn. In the counterinsurgency field manual, we make the point, in fact, that we should oversee learning organizations, and we need elements, events in our battle rhythm that actually force that and enable it. So every time the two stars got together, every one of the division commanders had to give one initiative that he or she was pursuing that might be relevant to the others, and also one lesson learned. So you're constantly working this. I would meet with the Center for Lessons Learned leaders, Army, Marine, Special Ops, Asymmetric Warfare Group, Counterinsurgency Center, all of these individuals in the process that would filter up to an hour with me once a month, and just many of these different activities and events to facilitate learning. And then I surrounded myself with some individuals who were willing to say, I disagree, boss. In fact, one of them had been thrown out of Iraq early on because as a full colonel intelligence officer, he said, excuse me, but we're facing an insurgency here. And the leader in the Pentagon didn't like that. And they said, send him back to the United States. I brought him back with me. H.R. McMaster, I've often said, never left something left unsaid, which is great. That's what you want. And he was up in the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London after a very successful battlefield command as a full colonel, said, bring him down to Iraq. He can do study after study for me. And, you know, the ambassador and I had been there for a while now. We thought we pretty much understood this. I've been there for 3 years at that point in time, ultimately did 4 total. And still, there would be one of these moments when he'd lay something out and you'd say, hey, boss, I don't think you actually recognize how significant the Iranian influence is on the Shia militia or something, you know, this kind of thing. These are big deals. These shape big ideas. So again, as a leader, you don't want to be surrounded by sycophants. We don't want to be surrounded by people telling you how great you are or whatever. You want to be surrounded by people who will tell the emperor that he doesn't have clothes on, intellectually speaking.
Yeah. Our number 2 at our firm, our president, Anna Hicks Hako, she probably disagrees with me 51% of the time. And that's the best thing that we could possibly have. Sure. Every morning we have a 6 a.m. phone call. Every morning, Karen and I have a 5 a.m. phone call. And the disagreements are much better than the, I think you're on track, Mike. I want to paint a visualization for our listeners. Literally, you're going, day one, you're in the Oval Office speaking with President Obama. And then the next day, you're in the Capitol being confirmed in front of the Senate, 94-0, by the way, which I don't see for a while.
Actually, CIA was 94-0. The Afghanistan, there was one, the senior senator from West Virginia often liked to cast a dissenting vote. So I think my confirmations for the surge, CENTCOM, and Afghanistan were usually 93-1.
Who was it, General? We'll put him on the podcast.
Senator Byrd. And,
okay, we're going to ask them why they voted.
Well, it'd be hard to do because he's obviously sadly no longer with us. But he wanted to be engaged more. I understood that. It was just very difficult. You're running a war, or you're doing this or that. And I couldn't always engage with him the way that he wanted to. He was a Senate Armed Services Committee member, but I don't think he attended hearings. Anyway, that was the one. But for CIA, it was 94-0 or 93-0, and that's somewhat rare these days, shall we say.
I don't think we'll see it again for a long time. Was there any point in your career, because I felt it in my late 20s when I was hired as the dean level employee for a law school and I was young and hadn't led before, that you felt either overwhelmed or imposter syndrome or anything where, and it went away for me, of course, after a year or two, but it was coming too hard, too fast. And then how did, for our listeners who are going to be leaders and leaders very early in their career, we have many, many listeners who will clerk for the Supreme Court, go on to be CEOs of companies. Was there any point where you felt like you were in over your head or it was overwhelming?
I'm not so sure I'd actually say that. This doesn't mean I wasn't working incredibly hard. You know, you don't get some of the achievements without really, truly. And by the way, there will be people that will say and have said, Petraeus was lucky. I was lucky in terms of timing or this or that. But luck is actually what happens when preparation meets opportunity. And I worked very, very hard to prepare for what ultimately happened, which was commanding 2 wars and a theater of war and then directing the CIA and so forth, but also for all the events along the way. I remember when I was getting ready for Ranger School, I just didn't ruck march endlessly, but I would do the physical fitness test. I would do the Ranger PT test back to back to back so that I was sure and to the highest level. So you get, 100 points in each one so that there would not be a circumstance where there's a Ranger grader who's tough on push-ups. I mean, I want to be able to do twice as many push-ups as I have to, if that's necessary. I want to be able to run so fast that there's no question that I'm going to be able to meet the standard. And I'm talking the very top standard. And you're prepared in every way you can. You're prepared intellectually. I studied the orders process and memorized all of this information, had really understood. I don't ever want to have to do laundry during Ranger School because you go through mud every morning in the first phase of the operation. You're literally crawling under barbed wire and mud. You cannot wear that uniform again the next day. They want you to be in a clean uniform. And so I brought something like 4 times the number of uniforms required. I just bought these old uniforms. They don't have any patches on them or anything in Ranger School. And everybody else is lining up for the limited number of washers and broken dryers. And I'm going out to my car, pulling 6 more out. You have to get really serious. I'm often asked, what's your general advice for young people? Number one is recognize that life is a competitive endeavor. You actually don't get a trophy or a t-shirt just for showing up in the real world. You get it for excellence. But what you want to do is not only be the best you can be and the best overall, if that's possible, you want to be the best team player at the same time. I got all 3 awards in Ranger School, and one of them was partly being the best Ranger buddy you could be. So it wasn't just the best overall. You don't want to get the best overall having your fellow Rangers students thinking that you crawled over their beds to do it.
One of the things you're clicking on is, I call it narrowing the goalposts. You'll get that expression having done the coin toss at the Super Bowl. But I mean, even for this conversation, we try to set conditions much more difficult than they could possibly be so that we never have to be overwhelmed when it's impossible. We tell the market of our listeners, if you're going to go take the SAT, take the LSAT, do a couple tests with 10 less minutes than the real test.
Absolutely. You obviously want to do that. Train to a higher standard than the absolute excellent standard. All of that. It's all about preparing for that individual endeavor, but then also preparing overall as well. So there's also reading going on. There's also, again, formal education. I was sent to Princeton to get a master's degree. That's what you have to do to teach at West Point. I was going to teach international relations and economics. And I decided, look, I got 2 years here. If I really load up extra courses and create some of my own and actually design courses for reading, directed reading, they're called, with specific professors to prepare me for the Ph.D. exams, I can do not just the master's degree and those general exams and the thesis and so forth, but I could actually knock out all the course requirements, all the general exams, the language exam, and the dissertation prospectus and defense of it in 2 years. And now that one may have been one where I started to feel a tiny bit overwhelmed.
There we go. I knew it.
What you do is you say, okay, I got to figure out how am I going to do all these things. I also had a young baby. So that was a challenge. But again, you just figure out in a very, very rigorous way. And there's no screwing around then. You're not partying. You're not having beers at night with your buddies. Again, I was married anyway, but I was still working out, still training and the rest of that. But you've really got to be very, very rigorous and disciplined in the use of your time. And you have to understand the rule book. By the way, I understood it better than they did because we had a course conflict. I found a rule that if you got an A- in a course final exam, you got credit for it, even if you never set foot in the room. That was, by the way, advanced macroeconomics, which is all manipulation of matrices, calculus, et cetera, that I hadn't used in years. But, I worked really, really hard, got all the lecture notes, went through them and rolled the dice in the final exam and got an A-. So you got to really work your way through this. And I thought it was doable. And it turned out that it was. And then I was able to go to West Point and finish the dissertation while I was up there teaching.
So our listeners are going to really click in on this part. You got an A-. How old were you at the time?
28, 29.
The typical person with a baby would feel overwhelmed. You're probably feeling a little bit of pressure, but what your mind is saying is problem solve, problem solve. I got an A-, but the school doesn't want to give me this grade. And you knew the manual better than the school. You were able to go and present.
Oh, I went to them ahead of time and I said, look, I've read the requirement that if you get an A- or better in a final exam, you get credit for a course. They didn't understand that I only had 2 years. They just didn't factor in. They only had one Army student at a time, typically in a year group. They limited it actually. And I went to them and said, you just don't understand. I can't say I'd like 2 more. They said you should take 2 years to do the master's, 2 years to do the PhD coursework and general exams, 2 to 4 years to do the dissertation. And I said, I only have 2 years. It took an enormous amount of overload, specially designed courses, all of these tactics, techniques, and procedures to get through all of that stuff. And it had never been done before, and it never has been done since. I should also know, gosh, I got a D in my first microeconomics. I'd had no economic background at West Point. In those days, you didn't have the general economic course that you now have, which I later taught. I was in a pre-med program, which was very, very competitive because there were only 8 students in our class that were going to, out of about 850 or so graduates, down from about 1,400 that started. So it's 1% of the class could actually go to medical school. I loved the subject matter. I loved chemistry, organic chemistry, human bio, all this. But all of a sudden, I actually got a slot. So I was something like 4 or 5 in the program because it just keeps winnowing down. And you're in the end of it, your senior year, you're all in the same class, basically. So I could count over because you sat by your rank. And so all of a sudden we resectioned and I'm sitting and I count over and I'm going to be, again, number 4 or 5 in the program. And that was when I recognized I loved the academic challenge of it. This is the highest peak to climb, but I actually don't want to be a doctor. So I just went infantry and declined to go to medical school. The problem with that was when I went to Princeton for graduate school and you had to do advanced micro and advanced macro for the PhD. Otherwise, you just did basic. I was wholly unprepared. I didn't even know that a supply curve went up and the demand curve went down. I mean, that's the level of my economics shortcoming. I had Paul Krugman's Econ 101 book that I'm literally, one chapter ahead of where we are in the course. And I ended up again with, I think, an A in the final exam. So it's always about how do you come back from this? Look, the individual who turned out to be my dissertation advisor, Professor Richard Ullman, Dick Ullman, who is a Harvard Rhodes Scholar, PhD in Oxford under George Kennan when I think he was teaching there. He wrote on my first paper, this has many good features, but I fear that the whole is somehow less than the sum of the parts. Whoa. So I went to see him and I said, look, I'd like to show you that I can do better than that. And instead of the final exam, I'd like to do a paper. And that paper ended up being the kernel of what became my dissertation with him as my senior dissertation advisor, and a wonderful, wonderful guy. And again, he kept me on the rolls for 2 years while I was assigned to West Point, and Princeton didn't charge me for tuition, which they could have done. I've seen that happen at some other schools, and that would have broken the bank. I was a captain on a government salary. I've been really indebted and grateful to that great university ever since, and I've done an awful lot of things for them since then.
The last time I spoke there, you're not going to know the answer to this, I bet, based on your schedule. There's a bar called the Barrister and the Alchemist that was started by a law professor and a chemistry professor. I don't know if you ever got to go have a beer after a class.
Is it the one where my picture is there as a...
I don't know.
Yeah, there's actually, there are pictures of, I don't know who's on the wall, what you do to get on the wall, but I'm on the wall and it's a picture of me when I was that age.
We know their pre-law advisor. We'll find it when I speak there next. I think your picture is probably on a lot of restaurants.
I think it's at the Nassau Inn.
So I almost feel like I'm talking to 3 people. You're doing these med school courses. You're doing macroeconomics. You're going to Ranger School. You're scoring highest in the PT. Is there a way to distill all this down into, are you a perfectionist? Is it work ethic? Is it a combination of a few things? You're obviously incredibly accomplished, more so than I'll ever be. But what can I learn from this as a listener or myself?
Try to be the very, very best you can be in those areas that really matter to your profession. Starting with West Point, there are 3 elements that are really important. One, obviously, is academic. So that's the intellectual realm. Another is physical and the whole physical fitness. And I was on the soccer team and also the ski team. In fact, our ski team won our division every year, which was New York. And then we went to the Eastern Collegiate Championships, which is a real thrill because there you'd see all the World Cup racers would come home to University of Vermont, New Hampshire, and Middlebury from where they were spending their winter semester. But in those days, it was true amateurs, no professionals. And they all wanted to go to the National Collegiate Athletic Championships and be All-Americans in addition to being on the national team. So you have the physical component, the intellectual component, and then you have leadership. And I think there was only one other person in the class who was a star man, it's called, top 5% of the class academically, varsity letterman, and a cadet captain. And I was on the brigade staff, the assistant adjutant. So you have clear areas, and the Army values those three as well. They want people that are reasonably switched on, whose intellectual elevator goes to the top floor most of the time. They want people that have the physical fitness that is required to have stamina and be able to perform under really stressful conditions. 6 hours of sleep a night, the minimum. Can you do that over a long period of time? That kind of thing. And then they also want the leadership attributes, the skills, knowledge, expertise, experience, etc., that can enable somebody to perform the four tasks of all leaders, because every leader does perform these four tasks. The difference is that the leader at the very top has the most important task of all, which is to determine the overall strategy, the overall big ideas. But everyone below that leader has to turn those into big ideas at his or her level. The problem is, of course, if the leader at the top gets the strategy wrong, you're sort of stuck with that all the way down. You might actually even think this is the wrong way. There were people during months leading up to the surge who said, excuse me, we're not achieving enduring results here. The Iraqi security forces can no longer hold what it is that we have cleared. We should go back downtown. We're going to have to. And actually, those gears were set into motion before we actually started the surge. But again, if you're not at the very top, you don't necessarily have the liberty to do what it is you'd think you should be doing. You generally are going to be confined by the decisions made at the very top.
What have you done in the few times that you haven't been the very best?
Try to do better the next time.
Okay.
I mean, look, you screw things up, you make mistakes. I've made big personal mistakes. Our units made mistakes. We had a non-commissioned officer use pages of the Quran for target practice. Every one of our combat outpost bases, everything, you always have a 25-meter range, and you're constantly re-zeroing your rifle so that the sights actually show where the round is going to go. There's a process for this. You usually use concentric circles and so forth. You do the same thing when you use different optics, a close combat optic, a night sight, whatever it might be. So this is about being really professional, making sure that where you aim is where the bullet is going to go. And that's not axiomatic, by the way. It's not set up. You have to make it that way. Well, anyway, this individual decided to use pages of the Quran, and a host nation worker, we had a lot of locals helping us on our bases with a lot of the recurring tasks that didn't require somebody in uniform. This ends up in the trash. He's taking the trash out and he sees this. And the next thing you know, within an hour or two, I'm apologizing to the prime minister of the country. President Bush calls him and publicly apologizes. These things happen. There are mistakes made. There are huge errors. Abu Ghraib that's indelible. There's no half-life to those images from the Abu Ghraib detention facility and the way the detainees were treated. Those images, again, are absolutely indelible. When stuff happens, when you make a mistake or the organization makes a mistake or what have you, you got to sit down, figure out why did it happen, what went wrong, what happened exactly, how do we reduce the risk of it happening again? And so again, this is all being part of a learning organization and being a learning leader as well. You have to do that explicitly. You don't just say, I want to be a learning leader or oversee a learning organization. You have specific events, activities, meetings, and all of this that push this, that operationalize it. By the way, I also would do 1 hour a month. I would do a secure video teleconference back with the individual who replaced me at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and had the 6 hats that I had, the 6 different titles when I was a 3-star in that position, because I didn't want to just learn lessons out in Iraq. That's not enough. I want the Army to learn them. I want the Army to make the doctrinal changes to the organizational structure, changes to our training, our leader development, our mission rehearsal exercise, the road to war, all of this stuff. And that's how you institutionalize lessons. They're not learned when they're brought to you or you identify them. They're learned when they're incorporated in the big ideas, communicated, executed, which you oversee, and then refined and do it again and again and again.
I think a lot of young listeners will experience, and I've experienced this, when someone in your organization makes a mistake, you give a great example of it. This is a young soldier, they're out of their mind, and they're using the Quran for target practice. You've probably never met this person. You don't even know their name. And 2 hours later, I'm going to guess, you're being blamed for this, like from left and right.
Oh, no, not only being blamed, you take responsibility for it. And so you have to do that. You have to own it. The same as when you make personal mistakes. You've got to own it, got to acknowledge it, got to try to learn from it, make amends for it, whatever it is that's required. But again, that's what you have to do. Now, then, of course, there's a determination, was this in good faith? In combat, there are actions that are taken by individuals sometimes that are, in a sense, illegal. They have exceeded the rules of engagement. They have exceeded the norms of the Geneva Convention and the laws of land warfare, which we tried to adhere to. In fact, early on, as a two-star, commanding the Great 101st Airborne Division during the fight to Baghdad, and then we air assault north to Mosul and get that under control, we had a situation we'd not been prepared for. It was we're holding lots of detainees. Normally, what you're supposed to do doctrinally is that units at the battalion, brigade, division level, those detainees, you push them up to where there's a big detainee facility run by the theater. Well, the theater didn't have this at that time. Eventually, we built it. But so we're stuck holding detainees, and we don't have people with experience. We don't have huge numbers of military police who are trained on how to carry out prison or detainee operations. And we sat down, what should we do? And I had great legal counsels all the time. I really had a lot of time for lawyers, especially operational lawyers. They're not trying to prevent you from doing stuff. They're trying to ensure that you can do what you want to do, but do it legally. And in this case, the colonel raised his hand and he said, "Sir, why don't we just try following the Geneva Convention? Let's not get cute. We don't know anything about this stuff. All we do is what's called tactical interrogation, very quick questioning, and then you push them on up to the theater level. Let's not get into trying to figure out how to make them talk. Let's just treat them like prisoners of war, even though we never declared a war. Let's observe the laws of land warfare." And what a great idea. How obvious, except that was not what some of the other units in the theater did. And those that did not arrive at that conclusion often had experiences where some of those who were overseeing the detainees took actions that were not consistent with the Geneva Convention. And you pay for that.
Yeah. I love what you said about taking responsibility. At a young age, I learned when you make a mistake, it was instilled upon me, admit to it, fix it, and then move on.
Yeah. And learn from it and, dust yourself off, get back on your feet, put the rucksack back on and start putting one foot in front of the other.
Fall down 6 times to get up 7.
There's a great old adage, don't tell me how high the guy jumped. Tell me how high he jumped back after getting knocked down. And that really is, I think, pretty important. That's the real measure of leadership. It's not how you deal with success. It's how you deal with adversity.
And I could almost quote Mike Tyson, everyone has a plan until they're punched in the face. And I love that quote.
That too.
12 years old. We can flip it to positives. I've read about 60,000 letters of recommendation in my life. What stands out to you when someone's applying to work for you? If I were to apply to work for you, what would be something you would look for in someone young trying to enter into your realm?
Well, I think you look for real achievement in the different areas that matter. And certainly the academic arena matters. And did they do great at a great school? If it's not a great school, were they exceptional? Did they distinguish themselves from the others? The ideal is, of course, you have somebody who goes to MIT and is high distinction or something like this, although that's the one school that I don't think gives summa cum laude. In fact, our son went there. So I remember at graduation day, I actually managed to be there at his graduation. I was gone for 3 of his 4 years in high school and then 3 of his 4 years in college as well. But again, look at what are the qualities, attributes, experiences, and areas of expertise you want in the applicant. How do they manifest themselves in that person's record? What did they accomplish? We would have individuals, for example, that were in the infantry, but at the 3 or 4 year mark, they were going to be transitioned to, say, quartermaster or ordnance. We needed more infantry, but as the pyramid went up, then you could shift over to these others that were a bit less pyramidal. And some of them didn't want to. They'd fallen in love with the infantry, and even though they'd maybe chosen quartermaster before they were in the infantry, they'd come to me and say, "Hey, sir, I really want to stay in the infantry." And my response was, "Okay, let me look at your officer efficiency reports. Are you the number one in your cohort? How'd you do at Ranger School? You didn't go to Ranger School and you're an infantry officer?" That's sort of a distinguishing feature. So what'd you do and how did you do in what is really central to that particular endeavor? Infantry branch. We just announced an associate position in the KKR Global Institute. The last time we did that, I think there were literally 1,000 applicants, and these were serious applicants. And the winnowing down process was very, very challenging.
Yesterday, we opened up our emails that were on pause at 11 a.m. and we received 163 inquiries by 11:03 a.m. and we had to shut down our email again. I think people don't realize is how competitive this world is.
Life is competitive. Deal with it. Get over it. Embrace it. Compete. If you don't, then don't expect to be rewarded. Don't expect to be selected. And by the way, it's okay not to be just fiercely competitive in everything. Families pay a price for somebody who is hugely competitive and deployed for 8 of my final 11 years in uniform or something like that. Happily, it all worked out wonderfully because I have a spouse and she had her own career. She was an assistant director, this 3-star equivalent in government.
The person who doesn't go to MIT but does get the job at KKR, what did they do?
They did exceedingly well. They got scholarships. Were you a National Merit Scholar in high school is a pretty good question.
Yeah.
Were you the valedictorian of your high school class? There's numbers of these. What did you do during your summer? How did that stack up? Did you do an internship with Goldman? Did you get asked back? So our son eventually did 8 years in the Army, multiple tours in Afghanistan, including as a second lieutenant rifle platoon leader in an airborne brigade when I show up as the commander. And then he goes to special ops. He was in the Ranger Reconnaissance Detachment and so forth. And he does more tours. He then goes to Harvard Law School, Harvard Business School, honors in both. So he goes to Debevoise, the law firm that he spent the summer with, and they ask him back. Did the individual get asked back? Is all I'm trying to illustrate here. Again, there are recognized achievements. National Merit Scholarship is one, and he had one of those as well, and was the number one in a class of 1,100 or something. But also very low key, very no drama, never overwhelmed, tests well. So again, there's lots of achievements there that you can look at and identify in somebody, and that's a big deal. If people really do want to be at the very top, they're really going to have to work at it. By the way, that doesn't mean that they can't have some balance in their life. I look at the leaders here and it's amazing what they do. And our very top, the founders, set a great example in that regard, but they're also still in the office every single day, but they take vacations. So anyway, it's all about achievement, and there are generally quite tangible measures of achievement. Then, of course, you get into the interpersonal skills, the leadership ability, these other elements. Is this person a team player? Because again, you want to try to be the best you can be, ideally the very best, but you don't want others to look at you and say, oh yeah, he did it by climbing over our backs.
Yeah.
You want to do it while you're carrying somebody else's rucksack up Mount Yonah during the winter phase of Ranger School, which is what I did. And I thought I saw the peak, and then we went over it, and actually the mountain was still going.
I live in Colorado. That's happened to me a number of times. You can think you're at the top because you can't see the next top.
And there you're at altitude.
I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I am interested in a hobby of yours for balance. What is something you do?
I work out pretty assiduously. I was a runner up until just a few years ago, and a pretty serious runner. It was very hard to be at the very elite level if you're working in the Army and you're going to the field and you can't have the kind of training. But I did, for example, in a marathon, I did a 250 flat marathon, which is moving along pretty quickly, especially given that you don't have the kind of time to do the huge mileage that most marathoners do. So you had to do it on 55, 60 miles a week. So they have to be quality miles. They're not going to be quantity. But I was very serious about running and working out very substantially. Now I'm much more of a cyclist, and I do that pretty hard. And I do it either on the road, especially when I'm out in Colorado and Aspen or places like that, where the riding is just insanely good. And you're starting at 8,000 feet and climbing 2,300 feet over 14 miles to turn around and come back down as you do in one of those rides out there, or actually 4,000 feet to get to the Continental Divide. So there's that component. I'm a swimmer as well, although I had a shoulder injury, but I'm coming back from that. So the fitness thing is a pretty big deal. And, we love going out to dinner with our friends. That's a big component. We've got grandkids. We're just spent a week with one side of the family. In fact, our son's side, 2 with another one on the way. And so we have a lot of fun there as well. But I love what I do. I like the intellectual stimulation. I'm in New York right now. That's where the office is. We live in Arlington, Virginia. Every night I'm here, we'll have a dinner with some group. Sometimes it's an actual event. Sometimes it's just startups. I'm invested in over 30 startups as well. And I'm on the speaking circuit, and I'm the Kissinger Fellow at Yale. I co-lead a graduate seminar in the spring semester. So all that stuff, you put it all together, and it's really intellectually stimulating. And then to ensure that the relationships and boots on the ground and so forth that are so important for doing geopolitical risk and then helping companies when they run into problems. I travel to 25, 30 different countries a year, many of them more than once. So I think I've been in London 6 times already this year alone, and already probably somewhere around 10 to 15 countries.
I'm in New Haven a bunch. I'm in New York City a good deal. I would love to go for a run one morning. I get up very early, so I'll email you one day when I'm in New York City. On a final note, I recently heard an interview with an author named Charles Duhigg who was talking about habits and how important habits are. And this is actually sort of an evolutionary paradox to me. As you know, we have negative human bias. We focus on the negative more than the positive as humans. But in developing habits, positive reinforcement is 20 times stronger than negative reinforcement. You know it instinctively. So if I were to hit someone with a ruler on the hand 20 times, they would get the same behavioral change if I gave them a cupcake once. And this person was talking about being in Iraq, and he was talking to a major, and the major said, look, Charles, the military, if nothing else, is a massive habit-changing machine. And I started thinking, like, how's that so? The movie Officer and a Gentleman came to mind. Louis Gossett Jr. is the quintessential drill sergeant. And this day after day to the main character, do better, do better, do better. A lot of it was negative. You're the worst, drop out. We don't need you. You don't belong. And where I landed, and this is why I wanted in on this, because this has been your career, he was getting positive reinforcement every second of his waking day through meaning, through purpose, and through camaraderie. In your career, if nothing else, I'm going to guess, has been meaning, purpose, and camaraderie.
Oh, yeah. It's a mission larger than self. And what an incredible privilege it is to do that. It's serving with others who feel the same way. Look, I was privileged to preside at the largest re-enlistment ceremony, we think, in history. And of all things, it was in Baghdad. It was the second year of the surge. It was July 4th, 2008. Senators John McCain and Lindsey Graham and Lieberman were there, the three amigos, as we called those three great senators. And I was the re-enlistment officer, stating the oath of enlistment, and 1,215 soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines were repeating it after me. We're filling an entire dome of one of Saddam Hussein's old palaces. How ironic that is. The next day, it was on the cover of the New York Times, above the fold, this sea of uniforms, everyone with his right hand in the air. And I'm looking at this, asking myself, what is this about? I mean, it's not for the stock options. The economy at that time, even though it was July of 2008, we didn't know that it was about to melt down. Employment was still at record levels. Everything was still seemingly under control, shortly about to have the Great Recession. But there were lots of jobs to be had in the civilian sector at that moment. And here they all are. And by the way, they know by reciting that oath, they're going to be asked to come back to combat again, because you can already see the shift in focus over to Afghanistan, the buildup that was conceived there, even as we had drawn down the 5 combat brigades that were provided for the surge. And again, all I could come up with was they feel privileged to be doing something that is really important to our nation with others who feel the same way, even though you don't beat your chest about this stuff. And actually, there's a lot of sarcasm and everything else, but there they are. And they feel privileged to be doing this at a time when everybody in the United States, even if they disagree with the policy that we are executing, they appreciate our service. And that is a big deal. But I'll go on and add affirmative leadership. So when you go through the website at Harvard, I talk about the 4 tasks of a strategic leader in considerable detail. Then I get into tactics, techniques, and procedures of leadership. And one of these is called affirmative leadership. This is not affirmative action. This is essentially positive leadership. And I'll give you an example. Let's say that you have a report that's due to me on Monday at noon. And on Friday afternoon, I have 2 ways I can go to you. I can say, hey, you better have that darn report on my desk Monday at noon, or I'm going to have a piece of your backside. Or I can say, hey, Mike, man, the troops are talking. They're saying that you have got something really special. I don't know if I'll be able to sleep Sunday night. I'm waiting to get this on Monday at noon when it's going to hit my desk. But I'm really getting excited about it as well. You've conveyed the same reminder, if you will, that that report needs to be there. But in one way, you've done it in a positive manner, in an affirmative manner. In the other way, you've done it in a negative manner. This is not to say that negative manner, drill sergeants, all that, the crucible kinds of events doesn't have its place. But when you're in the organization, you're no longer engaged in that kind of stuff. This is no longer plebe year, or the first summer at West Point kind of stuff. But it seemed to me always that latter approach, the affirmative approach, rather than the negative approach, the punitive approach, is preferable and brings out the best in most people. And I think one of the assumptions that you should have until individuals prove otherwise is that people really do want to do their best. They really don't want to be proud to be average, as we say. And by the way, none of us wants to be led by somebody who's proud to be average, especially not in combat. And I would lay that on the cadets at West Point. In fact, when I came home from my first tour in Iraq as a division commander of the Great 101st Airborne Division, I immediately called up the commandant at West Point. I said, I want to talk to the cadets who are about to graduate in 4 months. I want to tell them they've got to get super serious about this. It's no longer acceptable to be proud of the gentleman's bee or just sort of cruising through life and having a good time. You're going to lead America's sons and daughters in combat, and you got to be very serious about that. And they do not want to be led by somebody who is anything other than serious, because they want the professional who's going to give them the best chance of coming home alive. And that does not include somebody who is outwardly, clearly proud to be average.
Yeah.
Again, life's a competitive endeavor. Get over it, embrace it, and realize, again, you don't get a trophy just for showing up. You got to show up. Showing up is 90% of it, but it's actually an achievement that does set people apart. It does enable them to achieve what they hope they might be able to achieve someday down the road. Yeah, there might be timing and luck and other elements, but once again, remember that luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity.
And that purpose greater than yourself led you to public service. And for our listeners, many of which have huge ambitions and huge goals, I just want to be clear to them that you can take your huge ambitions and you don't have to go to big law. You can serve your country, you can serve a community, and that is part of having big goals and big ambitions.
Sure. No, absolutely. By the way, our son's back in public service. He took a huge pay cut to be an assistant U.S. attorney, and he loves it. And he finds it incredibly stimulating, meaningful, and rewarding.
Yeah. My final question is, you go to West Point, you graduate, top 5%. Ranger School Airborne, all the way up to 4-star general. I remember the talk of making you a 5-star general. We haven't had one since
Bradley. Omar Bradley was the last 5-star.
Yeah.
But that was a carryover from World War II.
Yeah. You've been the director of the CIA, you have a Ph.D. from Princeton. Like I said, I feel like I'm talking to 3 people who have done all that.
But it's never enough.
I have this feeling that maybe if you were to capture a moment in your entire esteemed career, it's going to be a visualization of not that, of something else, of another person even. It sticks out that you're most proud of.
Look, I think the most important thing I ever did was lead the surge. To take over a force that is engaged in a country that is engulfed in a Sunni Shia civil war with ever more terrifying levels of violence. And our men and women in uniform, our coalition partners, our Iraqi counterparts, turned that around, drove violence down in 18 months by nearly 90%. And the real measure is that violence continued to go down for another 3.5 years until tragically, right after our final combat forces and final 4-star left, the prime minister took an action that was highly sectarian and it just undid a lot of what it was. That enabled the Islamic State to reconstitute, go into Syria, and establish ultimately these caliphates in northern Iraq and northeastern Syria. But the accomplishment of the surge was really significant. Keep in mind that most of the advisors to President Bush advised, just let it go. It's irretrievable. We can't turn this around. And he not only did not do that, he actually provides additional forces for a new commander, a new ambassador, and gives us the latitude to change the big ideas 180 degrees and to be able to drive violence down and give the land of the 2 rivers another whole opportunity. And yes, the prime minister screwed that up to a considerable degree, but eventually it's a country that has continued to replace its leaders after elections. Sometimes it takes a year to create the coalition. But by and large, that was a pretty big deal. That was one for the history books, especially because very few people thought it could be done.
It was a big gamble for President Bush.
In fact, Tom Ricks wrote a book called The Gamble. So, yeah.
We're going to link every book you've recommended on this. It was a big gamble of President Obama to go into Pakistan after bin Laden.
That was a gutsy call. No question. I was the commander in Afghanistan at the time, by the way. The 3-star Joint Special Operations Commander, of course, Admiral McRaven, the man who got bin Laden, if you will, he was chopped to control of the CIA director, along with that team that did the operation, so that they could operate under Title 50 authorities, covert action, rather than Title 10 military They'd found him that was the right way to go about this, even though it was military forces. You better be sure that I was tracking that incredibly closely because we could inherit a lot of the downsides if that thing didn't go well.
What was your title then?
I was the commander of the NATO International Security Assistance Force, and I was also U.S. Forces Afghanistan, under which the special mission units, we never give our special mission units to a coalition.
Yeah. I loved how
Complicated, but that's how that works out.
I've read so much about that operation and how much redundancy Admiral McRaven had built in so that if X goes wrong, they had plan Y, Z, A, B, C, D, E. And I love the amount of redundancy.
Just cool as a cucumber, because that first helicopter settled. Yeah, I wouldn't call it crash landing, but it settled. It landed very hard and it was not flyable. And now you got a problem on your hands. Big deal. He just launched the alert bird. The problem with that was not the same type of helicopter. It had a much bigger radar signature. It was a Chinook, a huge transport aircraft. And we were worried that it might be picked up on radar. It turned out they didn't actually see it.
But there was a plan for that. President Obama would call back.
Absolutely. They had done this. They'd rehearsed it on a scale model innumerable times.
Well, I'm going to confide in you, General Petraeus. We rehearsed this interview. Thank you.
Privileged to be with you. Thanks very much.
What is the state of human nature? Are we designed to hug each other, or are we designed to Lord of the Flies fight each other? I have to ask.
It depends.
Okay. Thank you for your time and your candor.
Great to be with you.